What if one April morning in 1873, in the ruined soil of Louisiana, the sky itself turned black as the Colfax courthouse burned, and the bones of freed black men were scattered like broken promises? What if history conspired to bury not only their bodies but their voices, swallowed by silence, drowned in ash and pressed beneath the weight of lies? This is not just a massacre. It is a wound stitched shut by time, a secret rotting in the dark. And if these forgotten voices call to you now from the shadows of Colfax, then lean closer. Subscribe not merely to a channel, but to a covenant, a gathering of souls who refuse to let memory be murdered. Join us and let us exhume the truth together. The year was 1873, and Louisiana was heavy with storms that carried no rain, storms of memory, of vengeance, of hunger for power disguised as law. Colfax lay restless at the heart of Grant Parish, its dirt streets lined with sagging porches and shadows that seemed to stretch too long, even beneath the midday sun. Reconstruction was a fragile experiment, its promises carved on parchment but not yet written into the soil. For the freed black men of Colfax, the courthouse was no longer just a building of brick and timber. It was a sanctuary, a fragile ark against the flood of hatred gathering on every horizon. They had heard the whispers. White militias, hardened by defeat in war but not in spirit, had begun their march, muttering that the courthouse belonged not to freedmen but to them, by blood and by birthright. Rumors slithered through the town like snakes in tall grass. They would come armed, they would come at night, and they would come not for justice but for blood. Inside the courthouse, the air was thick with sweat and fear. Dozens of black men, farmers, laborers, fathers, sons, gripped rifles so old their wood cracked like dry bones, pistols with half their powder gone, and tools sharpened into weapons. Their bellies were empty, their throats dry, but their resolve stood iron against the door. Above them the rafters groaned in silence, as though the building itself felt the weight of history pressing down. One man, scarred by chains once worn, leaned against the courthouse window and peered into the night. He saw shadows moving where none should move, saw the faint glint of musket barrels reflecting the moon. He whispered a prayer, not of peace but of endurance, that their stand would mean something, that their children would not inherit silence. Others joined him, murmuring hymns like armor, their voices trembling yet fierce. But outside the mob was swelling. The air carried the acrid tang of gunpowder and sweat, of boots grinding dirt into thunder. They gathered like a tide at the courthouse gate, their faces lit by lantern flame, their words sharpened into knives. They spat curses, each syllable meant to strip dignity, to remind the defenders that in their eyes freedom was a trespass, a theft. The courthouse doors rattled as fists and rifle butts struck against them. Inside, hearts pounded like drums. A young man barely 20 clutched his father's hunting rifle and tried to steady his shaking hands. Another, too old to run, sat on the courthouse steps inside, his back straight, his eyes hollow but unflinching. The defenders knew they were not soldiers. They were men forced into war by the mere act of surviving free. The night deepened. Owls called from the trees, but their voices were drowned by the chants of the mob. The defenders' lanterns flickered low, shadows crawling across walls already stained by anticipation. And then silence. The kind of silence that thickens the air, that presses on lungs until even breath feels stolen. A single torch rose outside, its flame twisting against the darkness, held aloft by a hand determined to turn sanctuary into ash. The defenders' eyes fixed on it, every muscle tense, every prayer cut short. In that fragile heartbeat between darkness and fire, the fate of Colfax trembled on the edge of ruin. The torch tilts, flame spilling forward, and the wooden door begins to glow with the promise of destruction. The mob came not as a whisper, but as a storm. They poured into Colfax from farms, towns, and swamps, men who once wore gray coats now clad in rough homespun, their hearts still beating to the drum of a war they had lost but never surrendered. Their eyes gleamed with hunger, not the hunger of empty stomachs, but the deeper gnawing thirst for domination, for the world as it had been before emancipation broke their chains of power. They gathered at the edge of town like vultures circling a dying beast. Boots pressed into the dirt road, each step like the beat of an executioner's drum. Guns rested across shoulders, their barrels polished by rage and moonlight. They muttered to one another of riot and order, but their faces betrayed the truth. This was not justice. It was reclamation. It was revenge. Inside the courthouse, freedmen braced themselves, their backs against walls that already shuddered from the blows outside. Their bellies ached from hunger, their nerves from sleepless nights, but still they clutched their weapons, relics of past wars and scraps of survival. They could hear the mob chanting their deaths, words that tasted of iron and rot, words promising that freedom would be pried from their bones. A man at the window peered out and saw the torch still blazing in the crowd's hand. Its fire swayed like a serpent's tongue, promising to strike. He whispered to his comrades, his voice a low rasp that trembled yet carried weight. "They do not come to scare us, they come to end us." The courthouse felt smaller with every heartbeat, the walls closing in as fear pressed its hands around the defenders' throats. Some men thought of their wives waiting in cabins along the river, others of children who might never know the truth of why their fathers did not return. Yet none spoke of surrender. To surrender meant more than death. It meant humiliation, chains reborn, freedom erased as if it had never been written. Outside, the mob's numbers swelled until the dirt road seemed to buckle beneath them. A horse reared, its rider raising his musket high, and the crowd erupted in cheers like a carnival of violence. Lanterns swung from branches, casting wild shadows across the courthouse, making it appear already haunted, a mausoleum standing before its time. The first shot cracked through the night. A window pane shattered, glass spraying into the courthouse like shards of ice. A freedman staggered back, blood blossoming on his chest, his scream swallowed by the roar outside. The defenders fired in return, bullets whistling through smoke and splintered wood, striking blindly into the mass of bodies. But the mob only grew louder. Gunfire rolled like thunder, each echo swallowing the next. The courthouse quaked with the assault, its beams groaning as if the building itself wanted to collapse. Amid the chaos, the defenders' prayers grew louder, sung against musket fire, defiance wrapped in melody, trembling yet unbroken. And then above the smoke and screams, the torch arced forward. Fire kissed the wooden door, crawling upward like a beast set free. Sparks burst into the night, the smell of pitch and burning timber mingling with the iron scent of blood. As the flames licked higher, a second volley of shots shattered the courthouse windows, and through the firelit smoke, the mob began to charge. The flames spread like hunger loosed from its cage. The courthouse groaned as heat licked its timbers, the wooden door glowing red as if blood itself pulsed through its grain. Smoke curled upward, coiling around rafters like serpents, stinging eyes and choking throats. Inside, the freedmen coughed and staggered, their lungs filling with ash, yet still they gripped their rifles, determined to resist even as the very air betrayed them. The mob outside howled with triumph. Their shadows stretched long and monstrous against the burning walls, their faces lit in flickers of orange and crimson. To them, the courthouse was no longer a sanctuary but prey caught in a trap, writhing as fire consumed it. Their laughter carried through the smoke, cruel and sharp, each note punctuated by the crack of rifles. Inside, desperation reigned. Men pressed their backs against windows, firing blindly into the crowd below. Bullets found flesh and screams rose from the mob, but for each man struck, another stepped forward, eyes blazing with vengeance. Some defenders collapsed, their blood mingling with the ash beneath their feet, yet others dragged them aside, whispering prayers even as gunfire drowned them out. Then came the moment of unbearable choice. The flames, growing fat on dry timber, devoured the walls, their heat searing flesh, their roar louder than the mob's fury. Smoke swallowed vision. Men dropped their weapons to clutch their throats, clawing for breath that would not come. The courthouse was no longer a fortress but a tomb filling with fire. Some leapt from the windows. Bodies hurled into the night, their limbs twisting as they hit the ground. For a heartbeat, they tasted freedom in the cool night air, only to be met with musket fire. Shots cracked through the darkness, and men crumpled in the dirt, their screams cut short, their blood steaming against the earth. The mob jeered, dragging the fallen by their heels, their laughter a grotesque hymn to slaughter. Others remained within, unwilling to leap into certain death. They pressed themselves against the walls, their skin blistering, their hair singeing, their eyes streaming rivers of smoke. One man clutched a scrap of parchment to his chest, its edges curling in the heat. He staggered to the courthouse door, blood seeping from a wound in his side, and collapsed there, his hands still locked around the document as flames devoured the wood. Through the haze, a voice rose. Hoarse, broken, yet unyielding, it pierced the roar of the fire and the gunfire alike. "We will not vanish," it cried, each syllable torn from lungs collapsing with smoke. The voice faltered, yet others joined, murmuring prayers and hymns even as their bodies fell one by one. Their defiance clung to the air like smoke, a vow that memory itself could not be slain. Outside, the mob surged forward, circling the courthouse as the roof cracked and sagged, timbers collapsing in showers of sparks. They shouted in triumph, certain that death had swallowed all within. Yet in the ruins, amid the smoke and ash, something still glimmered, a parchment clutched tight in a lifeless hand, its ink smeared but its words unburned. As the flames consume the last beams, the mob pauses, noticing the figure by the door, a body still clutching that bloodied scrap of parchment, its edges glowing, its secret unspoken. When the flames finally collapsed the courthouse into smoldering ruin, the night did not end in quiet. It deepened into something darker, a silence too deliberate to be peace. The Red River, swollen with spring rains, flowed only a mile away, its waters black under the moon, a witness waiting to be fed. The mob dragged the defenders out, those who had leapt from the windows, those pulled from the ashes, and even those who had surrendered with hands raised high. No mercy awaited them. Men were lined against fences and tree trunks, their shadows trembling in lantern light, and rifles cracked one after another. Blood spattered into dust, soaking into the roots of Colfax. The earth itself seemed to drink greedily, as if long starved of tears. Those who still gasped for breath were taken to the riverbank. Their captors worked methodically, as though tying stones and tossing bodies into water were a ritual older than the land itself. The Red River swallowed them without resistance, its current folding them beneath its skin, carrying silence downstream where no court record would ever follow. In the reeds, frogs croaked, oblivious or complicit. The river became accomplice to murder, a grave that shifted and washed itself clean. Yet not all went unseen. A boy no older than 12 crouched in the brush, his heart hammering so loud he feared the mob might hear it. He watched as the bodies slid into water, one after another, their limbs slack, their mouths still open as if to cry out. He watched until he could not bear to look, but then his eyes caught on one figure. A man older with a gash across his brow was tossed into the current. For a moment he sank, then surfaced, his chest heaving, his eyes burning against the night. The mob had not noticed. The boy's nails dug into the earth as he tried to stay silent, his breath shallow, his body trembling like a leaf in wind. The man drifted with the current, clinging weakly to the reeds, his body half swallowed by mud and water, but his eyes still alive, wide with terror and refusal. The boy closed his eyes, praying the river would hold its secret. When he opened them, the reeds trembled, the current twisted, and the man was gone, either pulled under by the river's hunger or swallowed by the night itself. And the boy was left alone with the silence, his small body pressed into the mud, knowing he had seen what others would deny, knowing he carried a secret that could never be spoken aloud. In the morning, the river flowed smooth again, as though it had never held bodies, as though the screams had never touched its surface. But silence has a weight, and in Colfax, it settled over every cabin, every field, every grave. At the courthouse ruins, smoke still curled upward, and crows circled above the blackened timbers. On the riverbank, reeds bent in the wind, whispering, as if repeating the last breath of the one who did not sink quietly. The water glimmered with moonlight, and beneath it something shifted, not dead, not alive, but waiting. Years passed, but the ground of Colfax never softened. Where the courthouse once stood, only ruins remained, timbers blackened into char, bricks half buried in weeds. Yet the land itself seemed restless, as though refusing to heal. Locals spoke of unease when passing near the site, of winds that carried voices though no mouth had formed them. They whispered that the oak tree standing near the courthouse grounds had grown thick not from soil, but from the blood that once soaked its roots. At night, children were warned to stay away. They said lanterns sometimes flickered among the trees, though no hand held them. Footsteps circled the ruins when the moon was full, as if unseen patrols still guarded the courthouse walls that no longer stood. And when storms rolled across Grant Parish, lightning split the sky above the oak, and thunder followed not like weather, but like the echo of musket fire returning to finish what had begun. Among the freedmen's descendants, stories were passed from tongue to tongue in hushed tones. They were not written down, for ink could be seized but spoken quietly in kitchens, whispered between hymns in churches, murmured to children at night like lullabies woven from sorrow. They told of men who had refused to bow, of hymns sung until their throats collapsed, of bodies carried by the Red River but never truly drowned. These stories became a thread of survival, a rebellion against silence itself. Yet memory was dangerous. To speak too loudly was to invite notice, and those who tried were often made examples. A preacher once stood at his pulpit and dared to call the massacre by its true name, daring to say aloud what others dared only to whisper. His voice cracked like fire across his congregation, a sermon heavy with ghosts. That night his cabin was burned, and he was never seen again. His congregation did not scatter, but they did not speak his name either, only his words, carried in secret like contraband. And then came the discovery. One autumn evening, when the earth lay soft from rain, a man digging near the old oak struck something not stone but bone. He brushed the mud away to find a jawbone, its teeth clenched so tightly it seemed they had resisted even death itself. Word spread quickly, though quietly, of what had been found. Some said the bone belonged to one of the men executed against the oak, that his final scream had carved itself into the very roots. The townsfolk refused to acknowledge it. They covered the grave again, saying nothing, letting silence fall heavier than the rain. But silence does not erase. It thickens, grows, and seeps into the marrow of those who carry it. That night the oak swayed in a wind that did not touch any other tree, and those who passed swore they heard whispers among its branches, as if the teeth in that jawbone had finally opened to speak. The whispers did not stop. They pressed against the ears of anyone who dared linger too long, weaving themselves into the wind. And one voice, low and certain, spoke a word no one wished to hear: remember. Justice arrived in Colfax not as salvation, but as shadow. The massacre could not be ignored completely. Too many bodies, too much smoke, too many witnesses whose eyes still burned with terror. The federal courts took notice. Indictments were drawn, and for a brief moment it seemed the earth itself might shift toward truth. Survivors whispered hope that perhaps the bones buried in shallow graves would not be abandoned. But justice was a theater built on ash. In the courthouse, the air smelled not of righteousness, but of smoke that had long seeped into the wood. The accused stood tall, their faces set not with guilt but with pride, as though they believed themselves conquerors rather than murderers. They wore no chains. Their boots struck the floor as free men, while the ghosts of Colfax sat uninvited, lingering in the corners where the light did not reach. Testimonies were spoken, trembling voices breaking the silence with stories of fire and execution. Survivors described surrender met with rifles, men kneeling and pleading before being shot. They described the Red River swallowing bodies, the mob cheering as the current carried them away. The words trembled through the chamber, heavy with smoke and blood, yet the law twisted. Defense attorneys painted the massacre as riot, insisting the mob had restored order rather than shattered it. They called the dead insurgents, their crime nothing more than daring to claim the courthouse as their own. The jury nodded, some eyes already clouded with agreement before the first testimony began. The truth, like the men who had carried it in their bodies, was bound and beaten into silence. And then came the ruling that sealed the coffin of justice. The Supreme Court, far from Colfax yet complicit in its silence, declared that the federal government could not protect the lives of its black citizens against private violence. Murder was murder, they said, but it belonged to the states to punish, not the nation. And the states had no appetite for punishing their own. The killers walked free. The massacre was renamed, reframed, buried under legal ink until it became a riot, a skirmish, a thing blurred and diminished in history's records. The freedmen's cries were struck from the transcript, their bones sealed in soil, their names erased from verdicts that claimed neutrality but delivered betrayal. Yet not all records vanished. In attics and hidden chests, journals remained, fragments of ink scrawled in trembling hands. A witness described the river swallowing bodies in moonlight. Another detailed the faces of the men who raised torches against the courthouse gate. These words were fragile, easily burned, yet they outlived the verdicts, whispering truth to those who cared to listen. But one testimony never reached the records. A survivor, trembling as he stood before the court, swore an oath that his voice would not waver. His words began to spill names, places, acts so brutal they left the room in silence. And then, without explanation, the testimony ended. His words were cut, the pages missing, his oath swallowed whole. Outside, as the trial concluded, crows circled above the courthouse roof. Their calls echoed like laughter or warning, as if they knew that justice had been strangled once more, its ashes scattered across Louisiana soil. And in the silence after the verdict, the whispers returned, carried on the wind like smoke. By the end of the century, Colfax had changed, yet the ground where the courthouse once stood remained restless. The building was gone, its beams burned into memory, its stones scattered into other foundations. Grass had grown thick, covering the scars, but beneath the roots the earth still carried blood. When the wind passed over that place, it did not sound like ordinary wind. It moaned, low and unbroken, as though the soil itself had not forgotten. Children walking home at dusk quickened their pace near the site, clutching one another's hands, their eyes fixed on the oak that loomed above the ruins. Their elders told them never to linger, for the tree was a sentinel, a vessel of memory too heavy for human shoulders. They said if you stood beneath its branches at night, you would hear hymns rising faintly from the ground, voices singing against gunfire long since silenced. Some swore they saw lanterns bobbing in the distance, moving in lines as if a procession of ghosts still marched to defend a courthouse that was no longer there. Generations later, farmers digging along the edges of the old foundation struck metal. Musket balls, rusted chains, nails bent into grotesque angles by heat. In the 1920s, a boy found a bullet lodged deep in the wood of a tree trunk, the lead swollen with time yet still carrying its bite. These relics were carried home, placed in jars, whispered about in kitchens but rarely shown in daylight. For in Colfax, memory itself was dangerous, and those who held it risked more than curiosity, they risked being marked. Yet memory is stubborn. Oral traditions wound themselves around the silence like vines strangling a ruined wall. Descendants told stories not with the language of textbooks, but with the rawness of grief. How their grandfathers sang hymns until the flames took them. How the Red River turned black for days after. How one survivor carried scars across his chest that spelled truth clearer than any verdict. These stories passed through generations like contraband fire, ensuring the massacre lived even when history books ignored it. But Colfax itself betrayed its silence. On humid nights, the air grew heavy, and those who passed by swore they could hear water sloshing though the river lay still.